Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Put Your Donor Data to Work, 5 Frameworks to Develop Your Top KPIs. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you who are here for the first time, I'm so glad that you're joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Cevella, and I'm a program associate based in New York City, and I'm joined today by my colleague Tracy Kaufman, who's our community outreach manager here in NYC as well. We will be supporting today's webinar by managing polls, as well as collecting questions that you ask along the way and posing them during our Q&A. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we want to share with you that on February 1st, we joined forces with GuideStar to become Candid. Together, we have over 88 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. Candid can help you research organizations that matter to you. We can also help you figure out which organizations are working to improve the same causes and communities as you. And of course, you can continue to learn through a variety of our training resources. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources that they need to do it. To learn more about our capacity building training programs, you can visit grantspace.org. We offer courses across the country at a location near you. I would now like to turn the controls over to our presenter, Nina Derimer, so she can display her presentation. And as she takes the reins, I'd like to go ahead and introduce her briefly. So Nina Derimer serves as the general manager and head of marketing for Neon One, a powerful technology ecosystem fueling mission-driven organizations to build capacity through software services. She has spent the last 10 years working with nonprofit data, software implementations, website development, and helping nonprofits create strategies for growth that pull together mission and industry best practices. Thanks for joining us today, Nina.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get to talk about donor data. All right, well, I think we're ready to get started. And I'm coming through clear, right, Elizabeth? Everyone?
Crystal clear.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure. So I thank you so much for that great introduction. I've spent my entire adult life basically working in nonprofits and have always found my way to data and understood the importance of it. I don't know how that happened, but it's always been a really important part of my career, and how much I love it and how much I think is buried in there that can really help organizations grow and put together meaningful strategies. So that's why this presentation and this type of information means so much to me. I'm going to kick us off by talking a little bit about what we're going to cover from an overview perspective. And we're going to start out by defining first what I have meant by, I've talked a little bit about leading and lagging indicators in the introduction to the presentation and what the learning goals are. So we're going to start out by defining them. And the hope is to move that over into how do you take this information and apply it back to your organization based on its size, based on, the goals that you may be setting or trying to figure out what direction to head with. So that's the big part of it, is understanding what the differences are and how to translate that over. The next piece is really around what's the process to get through this piece of, to take a piece of data, to work it through a particular framework, and to understand at what points you should be interjecting your own knowledge about your nonprofit, when you should be looking at best practices in the marketplace, and just thinking about the assumptions you may be carrying with you as you take a look at your data and try and sometimes poke holes in it, sometimes confirm what you feel like you already know, but have that really good grounding in what the data can actually provide you and get comfortable with it. And then finally, this is the most exciting part, if we can find it in a data, is there are powerful patterns that live there. And once we can identify them, we can use that to grow and build upon. We can come up with cool tests to run a new fundraising program or a new outreach strategy, and really make that impact even bigger. So those are the main focus areas of what we're going to cover. Going to be super practical in a couple of areas where we're actually digging into the data and learning a little bit about how Excel can help you run, what reports to run, what pieces to look at. So that's the overall structure. We're going to start here with actually our first poll. So Elizabeth, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Nina. So we want to get a sense of who's in the room and particularly around what your feeling and experience is with donor data. So Nina, we have a pretty split audience today. There's 35% of the room that says they're fairly new. Another 35% say that they work with it, but there's plenty to learn. 23% of the room is looking for some tips, and 5% of the room has seen it done, and other folks just want to know how to help their colleagues as well. Any thoughts on who's here with us today?
Yeah, I mean, that's great to hear that we've got a good mixture because it takes every single person having a connection to data, no matter what their interest or skill level is, in order to make it work across the organization. Nobody does it by themselves. So I will make sure that we're kind of covering each of the different types of experience levels as I go through some things today.
Great, thank you.
And so I'm going to pick it back up here by talking a little bit about some of the KPIs you've probably already seen. So the most common ones that we see, in blog posts and online, have a lot to do with tracking year over year donor and donation growth. So there's those big stats out there by like the Giving Institute that releases a yearly poll on how much the overall donor community is growing or not growing, and then that break that down by different segments. So that's one of the interesting areas that's tracked in multiple ways. Donor retention and rate is another big one. And when we start looking at it, you've seen different charts and presentations of these. In most cases, these are always in that lagging indicator category for a KPI. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But these are the ones that I see most commonly brought up, and I think they're super useful as a starting place. But then often there's a next step that needs to be done, or there's a relevancy to the organization based on its size or based on when it got founded that needs to be considered in terms of how useful particular KPIs are for that org. So that's where I try and nuance that a little bit, but these are some of the main common ones. I love a good visualization where we can see, like this nonprofits data that's in the corner for the donation growth piece. There's a lot to see in this. There's not the overall numbers, but you can tell what times of the year they're most busy. You can tell when the growth spurts have been happening, and you can also tell a little bit about when we might need to put a little bit more outreach out from that organization. Quarter 2 looks, like there's not maybe as much growth going on, but there's clearly people who are paying attention later on in the year that maybe we could take advantage of. So, there's all kinds of things that visualizations of these KPIs also help. So that's one of the things that I stress a lot once you've got a good metric that you're working with. Moving over into the actual definitions, though, which I think are important to start with here. I always start first with this lagging indicator concept. This is what people are most familiar with. And this is about reporting on something that has happened. So it is always in the past, hence the lagging piece of it. It is something that you are looking at after the effect. After the event, and making sure that you are constantly benchmarking. And this is really important when you think about, okay, I want to make a couple of changes, or we want to try something new. How are you going to know whether that was successful or not if you don't have your metrics in place in the first part? And that's what lagging indicators really help you do, is understand where you're at right now versus where you want to be, and whether what you're trying is working. I have this little diagram in here because I think it's a useful transition over into talking about leading indicators. Lagging to me sits on the side of this donate, thank, report side, where things have already been put in motion. And then the leading indicators, they're really talking about what we're doing on the engagement and the stewardship side. So a lot of those are measuring how active are we in talking to our donors, how much are we putting out content and stories about the work that we're trying to do is reaching them, and that they're consuming or finding interesting and responding to, that might trigger them to donate later down the road, or continue to donate or increase their donation. So those are the ways that I think about where you're tracking leading indicators in that donor life cycle, but they are the things that point your organization forward. So I'm going to give some examples later on, but really these are measurements that are driving the effect of the lagging indicators. So they provide you this ability, depending on the size of your data, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. They provide you this ability to almost say, if I can increase the amount of people visiting my website, or I can increase, the number of prospects that we have in our major giving pool by X percentage. What do I think is going to happen? And what are going to be the effects to my lagging indicators over on the other side? So I tend to work backwards from lagging to leading, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but at the end of the day, it's the easiest to consume is reporting on what you've got, knowing where you stand, and then thinking about all the pieces that come together to make those numbers possible and thinking about what you might want to change or try new. So we'll be working to drill down from those popular lagging KPIs that I brought up earlier into the leading ones with a couple of practical examples. When I think about this, it's always a question of, well, I have so much data, or maybe I have not that much, but it's disorganized. What's going to be the most impactful place for me to start? And transactional data, I think, is the easiest in a lot of ways to wrap your heads around. It's some of the most important because it allows you to figure out how to grow your programs or your overall ability to carry out your mission. So this is really the crucial backbone of where, organizations are trying to understand data and grow that revenue and donor stream. So this is what I tend to focus on. You can start out with something as simple as having the date, the donor name, or the identifier. In my data, you'll only see kind of general IDs because we're trying to keep some, keep it away from getting any too specific, but some kind of identifier for you to point out unique donors, and then the amount. And then the additional layer that you can put in with transactional data, especially if you're just getting started with this, is actually around payment methods. So what are the ways that people are choosing to make those gifts? I think there's a lot of conversation out there around the transition from offline to online giving, whether it's going to all flip in 2021, 2022. There's a lot of different ideas about how important online giving is going to become. But for the majority of nonprofits, the reality is that it's happening offline, and especially in those major gift categories, it's certainly happening offline. So paying attention to that percentage and nuancing some of the way that you look at the data between those two categories can be helpful as well. The strategy you employ on the offline side is probably not going to work as well on the online. And then finally, having some kind of category of donation when you're collecting, when you're thinking about like columns on a spreadsheet, essentially. We've got the date, we've got the donor name, we've got the amount, and then we've got these 3 additional pieces to start with. And category can mean a couple of things from my perspective. It can be the type of donation. Maybe you think of donations as coming from individuals or companies, or you want to put it into a pledge like structure, or it's a grant. It is important to pay attention to that. And then for others, it might mean we run specific types of campaigns that fund a program, or it's a designated fund that the donor has said that it can only go to that. So that might be an additional nuance that you want to pay attention to. But I try and keep it really simple to start with when you're first digging into this stuff, and then layering in additional columns to that spreadsheet or that data set can help you add those layers. But starting out somewhere strong is this can be enough if you don't have access to more than this. The other big one that is a little bit harder, in my opinion, to work with because it's often not as well structured, or people type it in differently, or it just comes with a lot of different challenges. They may not want to reveal this type of information about themselves, is contact data. There's a lot of work that can be done around demographics, how regional your nonprofit is, whether you should be running events in a different part of the country, or if you're a community-based organization, you may already know those types of items, but understanding how big your reach is and who it is that is within your systems or within your spreadsheets, however you're tracking that. The main things that I also find that people run into when talking through some of these is where to get started is, how much data do I actually need? And I think you can work with something as small as like 200 to 300. You just have to be careful of if you've got big outliers. So for transactional data, if you've got a couple of donations in there that are $10,000 and you've only got 300 donations, you're going to have to filter some of those out, maybe set them aside and work with the remaining set. If you've got a bigger data set, you might be able to handle that. So it just kind of works on scale. And sometimes I'll just play around and remove a few of those bigger ones. I'll remove the top 10 donations and see if it gets me something more useful. Because the goal is really to be predictive. Like, how much can I say I can predict what is going to happen if I increase my outreach X percentage? So if your outreach is going to be focused on major gifts, maybe you do want to focus on those major donors. If you're trying to do online fundraising, you maybe need to filter those out. The next one I had in here is, what if the data is formatted inconsistently? That's why I keep it simple with the number of columns that you're trying to use. And then there are a number of tips and tricks in Excel you can do to reformat things, break things up into different columns, use filters to catch the things that are outliers and fix those up. And the goal is then to make sure that you know what you're trying to use that data for, so that you understand that the time you're putting in is valuable. That's where a CRM or some kind of software product can really help you too, is it can help you keep those formatted correctly. But not everyone has those tools available to them. So it can work either way. Just keeping it to like 4 or 5 columns that you want to ask your top KPIs from, though, and keeping that data really clean can be a good starting place. And then my final in here is like, how do you even come up with the questions that you want to ask about your data? I kind of think of it as this conversation, which sounds very cheesy, but I spend a lot of time with these spreadsheets and I really love data. And there are a lot of things that you can ask of it to see, like, is what I believe to be true about my organization actually backed up by anything? Am I able to nuance my own understanding of how the work I'm doing is impacting the organization overall by looking at a couple of different data points on a regular basis? Because it does change things just to interact with it and ask questions. So that brings me to talking through the main frameworks that I would want to start with when I'm looking at donor data. And the first one up is that growth metric that we were talking about earlier. What's the trajectory of the organization? And there's a couple of really primary ways to do this. I always talk about year over year. That could be calendar year, that could be fiscal year. And then the other one, if you have a really seasonal organization, is potentially to pick a trailing period. So what that would mean was like the last 3 or 6 months maybe. And you compare that 3 or 6 months to the previous 3 or 6 months, or the same 3 or 6 months from the previous year. So I love cutting it up a bunch of different ways, to be quite honest. Sometimes you'll find patterns just by looking. I'm going to look at it year over year. I'm going to look at it trailing. I'm going to look at depending on what you've changed about your organization, it might be good to look at a couple of different views in that regard. The next one up is engagement. So what I mean by this, it could mean a couple of things. It could mean your donors are continuing to donate. They repeat multiple times. Or it could just mean that you have a greater activity with them. So they are responding to your emails, or they are attending events, or they're volunteering more, whatever the case may be for your particular organization. But the focus of this presentation is really donation data. So I definitely think this is really important, to pay attention to the people who've helped build what your organization is and make sure that you're taking care of them as well. The volume question that I have in here is around average, that average donation size, definitely a lagging indicator. One of the most popular ones. If I add new donors, I'm not going to know what every single person is going to give me, but I can take an average over, if I add 500 more, that's going to equate to approximately what in new donations overall. So it's really important to know that. The one that I think is the most interesting is, am I going to be able to find out what is the gap between what I've been told I need to do as a fundraising director, or as the executive director, or somebody who's trying to make the plan for the goals, or they've been handed goals? What is the gap between what we're actually doing now? If we just continued as is, what will we achieve? And what is what we want to get to? And do I know what's driving that gap? And if I don't, we can dive into some of those data points that help me understand how big the gap is, what I can do to close it, where some of the places are that I have, the most traction already. So I think that's probably the most exciting of all of these. Channel is the one that I've talked a little bit about as well, that online versus offline piece. What do we really think donors at this organization prefer? What do they want to communicate with us, and what can our organization sustain most effectively? So it's kind of that dual question there. And the online piece is growing, but for a lot of organizations, it's just not the main piece of it yet. And if they're getting online donations, they tend to be smaller. It's not true across the board, but they tend to be smaller. So you're going to need greater traffic. What tools can you use to help boost that online presence while not forgetting about, the people who've been responding to your direct appeals for years? So I think those are the main frameworks that we're working with in this presentation as we take a look through some of the data. That brings us to our next poll question. So Elizabeth, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you. So what we want to know is which of these frameworks are you currently most familiar with? And for those of you who have already been working with data, I'm sure there's some that are standing out in your mind. For those of you that are fairly new, some of these might be ringing a bell for you as well. And if you're not familiar with any of these, well, you're in the right place. Nina's going to walk through all of them, but let us know in the chat that, you're fairly new. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And Nina, I am sharing that there are some people that are totally green, and they've let us know that through the chat. So there's a few folks there. But for everyone else who did actually submit their poll responses, this is what that breakdown is looking like. So 38% are sharing that year-over-year donor or donation growth, 27% are sharing repeat donations and retention, 18% for average donation size, and then followed actually by that online versus offline giving at 11%. And it looks like 5% are familiar with gap analysis, but definitely not the majority of the folks that are here.
Mm-hmm. That's super, and I mean, I'm not surprised in like those, that the top ones are there. And I am kind of excited to hear that gap analysis piece, because that means a lot of the presentation that we're going to go through is going to be super relevant of once you know those other items, what are you supposed to do with them?
Great.
So happy to move on. All right. So the thing I'm going to start with here to run us through these frameworks is actually an example. I started out working in faith-based organizations when I was working in nonprofits and getting my hands into some data. And so I've picked one of our organizations that works with Neon One. Just to give you a little bit of background on this organization, they're a 30-plus-year-old group. They're really stable. They've been around, it's actually older than that, but they've really been doing their fundraising operations and have data going back about 30 years, although it's a small set. And they're in kind of a new position here. They're getting ready to do their first capital campaign. While the goal is to raise $200,000, and there's a big reason for that. A lot of it has to do with the new staff they want to add and the facilities that they provide, and it needing a couple of upgrades. So there's a strong story behind the number, but there's a little bit of a concern over like, well, how do we get to this really big number, and where are we at right now? So what they have historically been able to rely on is their annual appeals out to a donor base of about 300 people. They've got a bigger group than that, but those are the people they can rely on to continuously give. And then some grant and institution-based funding alongside some traditional pledges for this type of group. So that's where they're sitting at. And when I think about where to start with this organization, I definitely, I start with that growth question. So the most obvious one is, what volume of growth is even going to be necessary for where this organization is at in order to hit $200,000? It's going to need to happen over a year. Is it going to take a couple of years? How do we want to be presenting this to our donor base? How do we want to get that excitement and energy going? So we need to know where we're at and what our best successes have been. That engagement piece. So what percentage of donors can we count on going into this campaign? We know they're going to give, or we're pretty sure of it, as long as we pay attention and are really thoughtful about our approach to them. So what do we think we already, of that $200,000 is probably already is going to be covered by that donor base? Volume, what's that average donation amount, so that we can do some averages and do some forecasting of what we'll need to get to in order to close that gap, which is the next piece. So how many new donors? This one builds off of that previous question and the engagement. How many new donors are we going to need in order to make that goal possible for that $200,000 amount? And then finally, which channel is going to be where I need to be spending the most of my time as an organization? Or how are we going to make sure that we're not missing one versus the other, the priorities that are going to go into a direct mail appeal versus, a more complex peer-to-peer campaign, for example. So those are the ways that we're going to be applying, the questions we're going to be applying to the data. I'm going to go through a little bit of the analysis first that was done off of that data. So what are some of the conclusions that we were able to draw by looking at it? And then I'm going to pivot over to talking about actually working in the Excel file itself to walk through some of those questions in different ways that I cut up the data. So after looking at this for this organization, their best year, which was 2018, so we looked at the past 3 years worth of history, and I generally try and keep it within, 2 to 3 years, because organizations change, donor bases change so fast in many cases that you really, going back 10 years is probably not going to tell me that much. So I try and keep it within that tighter period. So $60,000 was the highest fundraising amount that they'd had in the past 3 years. And the reason that they hit that 60,000 as opposed to 30 or 40 in previous years was these two main items. So they had a 45% growth in donations, and I was able to see that actually in the data. I was able to compare people like, show me everybody who's making 500 or who made $500 gifts in the previous years against how many gifts of that size we got in 2018. And so 45% growth in that category, which is a really great thing to see. And then the other big one was that they had a huge swing in growth in donors making contributions 100 to 499. And what's most exciting about this what I know about the nonprofit is they've got a lot of young donors who are making that transition from maybe just graduating from college to making, a $25 gift to being able to jump up into another category. And we can actually see that in the data. So I'll dive over into looking at some of that in the next piece. But what this means, though, to get from 60 to 200,000 is we're going to have to do a 233% growth. That's an incredibly aggressive number. So that also gives me some feedback from a strategic standpoint of like, this probably isn't going to happen in a year, but it might be possible. But it gives that nuance to the planning around this, that it's probably going to take us, we might be able to get from 60 to 100,000 if we do a really good marketing campaign and really excellent outreach, but it's might be unlikely for us to try and get to that 200,000 in exactly a year. The average donation size we found out was around 200. What I talked a little bit about earlier was that this is a pretty small data set, and so they did have a couple of $10,000 donations, and I filtered out the top 5 or so donations that to get this average, so that I didn't end up with something that's pretty radically skewed. And so I always take a quick filter on data sets to make sure that I can tell what the variance is, how many different types of giving categories they ought to have. So they had 64 donations in that over 500, 100 donations in that 1,000 or 100 to 499. And what that means, with an average donation size of 200, is they're going to need 700 new donors. Kind of keeping those ratios, if they grow in the same proportion, so 64 versus 100 as we have now, we'd need about 700 new donors. So that's quite a lot for this organization that only has 300 existing active donors. And then 43% of the donors are repeat. So we know who we can count on. And then we also know that we've got this pool of about 138 donors to re-engage. So what I'm able to pull by starting to look at this data is like, where am I at? What do I know that I've got already? Who is the open opportunity that I have that I need to do some outreach, because there's more potential than what I'm tapping into right now. I've got those 138 donors who have disappeared, that I know they've given in the past, and I can go find them again. And then that online versus offline is that the majority of the engagement has been happening online, with the exception of the major gift category, but there's only like 2 or 3 of those. So what I want to focus on then is probably more of an online strategy, and push that number as far as I can. So at this point, that's some of the main takeaways, that the highlights that I pulled out of the data that I was looking for, that fits into some of those frameworks. And at this point, I'm going to pop over to the the actual Excel. And let me just, I'm sorry, something didn't work for me, and I apologize for that. So we'll just pop up this right here. So what I've pulled and what should be sharing in front of you.
One quick second, Nina. I'm
Yep.
going to go ahead and prompt your screen to display one more time.
Okay. And okay, sorry about that, Elizabeth.
No worries.
And is the Excel showing, or is the GoToWebinar showing?
We're seeing your Excel.
Okay, good. All right. And so what we're looking at in front of you now is actually the list of transactions. So I've got my unique donor ID over here because I didn't want to have names mixed in. And we've got the transaction date. What I've done manually actually is add a couple of things that I have found useful to let me do some trending over time. So if you have a system that can automatically generate these types of columns like quarter and year, gift year, that's great. If you don't, I've taken the transaction date, done some filtering, and added these tags in pretty much manually. Copy and paste, drop it in. Did it in about 5 minutes, so that I can do some more analysis later on. And what I also have is that total donation amount. And I have a couple of different categories in here. It used to have more like events and campaigns, but I had to remove some of that data. And then the online versus the offline. So this is the simple data set that I am starting with. And what I find useful to do instead of counting and doing some of that filtering, or in addition to that, is actually start with some pivot tables. So I would end up selecting all of this data using the insert and selecting pivot tables over on the side here, and then it would pop open. And some of you have probably done this, but just walking through some of the steps of how I got to where I am on the other tabs here. It'll pop open this, you hit OK, and it'll open up an additional tab for you to begin building. And what I have done on this tab is the first question here is donation volumes by tender. So I've opened up that section, and I'm just dragging in columns here. So I've got my donation amount down in the values. So that's what's displaying these numbers right here. And then I've got my years running across the top as the columns. And really it's just a drag and drop. And what it immediately does is it does some counting and some summation for me. You might have a piece of software that can also do this for you. And if I want to nuance it a little bit farther, where I want to see how they're actually giving, I can drag that tender type down in and see the breakouts. So this is where I get to start playing around with, am I going to be looking at major gifts that are being made online? Am I primarily looking at check gifts? And a lot of these, once I take a look in further, the beauty of some of this pivot table stuff is that once you see something that you're interested in, you can click into it and it'll pull up the full list for you so that you can dig in further. So what I can see now, once I popped open that, like I want to see what's in that $40,000 check area in 2018 and do some sorting and filtering, which I can apply just by hitting data and filter, and it drops those filters in for me on the top row. And just do some sorting of like, where are, I'm at this point, I'm just exploring. I'm trying to get, my orientation to what's happening in this set. And I can see that a lot of this traffic is happening in Q4, which is where I clicked from the previous tab. And that, I've got some major gifts that are driving this number up pretty high. But then if I want to take a look at, what's going on in the online category and how those donations are falling out, we've actually got some surprisingly, larger gifts that are being made online, and it's not as it's not as low as I might have expected. So we've got a bunch of different things that you can look at. I tend to, I always want to know more. I want to know, why is this number the way it is? And a lot of times that isn't an easy formula. That's more of the data showed me something that I want to pay more attention to. So it showed me like what's the discrepancy between my online and offline engagement. Most of the actual dollars, if you take out those top, $10,000 gifts, are related to are happening in that online category. So what I love about doing stuff like this is it points that out for you, and it's as easy as dragging and dropping some of these columns in to really divide things up in a different view. And then if you want to get even more into this, you can start adding in formulas to do something like, we might do a year-over-year growth and just click on some of these tabs and put in, if I convert that over to percentage, I'm looking at about a 13% year-over-year growth. All I did was divide this by this previous column and then subtract 1, and it gives me my growth percentage. And I could do the same thing for each of these years if I'm trying to get a sense of my trajectory. So it just allows me to start seeing, a little bit more into what's happening on a summary level. And then the next piece over here that I wanted to call out in terms of how we're digging through some of these items is, that year-over-year actual growth category, where we can see what quarters the activity is happening in and do some comparisons to one another, so that we can see, the majority of the donations happens at end of year. Not that surprising given the organization, but I can dig in more about, what was the real spike that happened in Q4, and were there any associated campaigns. So these are the types of, pivots that you can open up over time. And the more columns you have, the more you can actually layer this piece in. You can also decide to, within the columns, you can do some filtering. So if I needed to, let's say I wanted it all summarized up, but then I wanted to say, okay, only show me a particular year, I could add that into that filter column and then say, okay, I only want to see 2018, and it'll do a modified presentation of that information. So this is the kind of stuff that I love doing when you're working with the Excel file, because you can cut it a bunch of different ways really fast, and you can start sorting the information in a really productive fashion, and that will give you those percentages and knowing where you're at for those lagging KPIs that you want to track, and you can do it in a matter of minutes. So at this point, I'm actually going to pivot back over to the presentation, but I'm happy to answer any additional questions, Elizabeth, if you wanted to pull anything, or we can save those to the end.
We did have one question here. If you could actually explain how you calculated the percentage growth.
Sure, yeah. So what I did, and I'll actually go back to the Excel here, all you ever do with a percentage of growth is you take the year that you're starting with. So we want to go with, let's go back to this one right here actually, and select out all of the piece. Well, that's not going to be, okay, we'll do like this quarter to this quarter. What you're trying to do is you take the one that you're trying to determine the growth of. So in this case, the $30,618, you divide that by the previous year, and then you subtract 1, and that will give you that percentage of growth. So we've got this divided by this minus 1, and that tells us that in between Q4 of 2016, if we're comparing that quarter to the Q4 of 2017, it did 19% year-over-year growth. All right. The next layer, after you've done some of that analysis, so those were the metrics that I pulled out as I was looking at the data from that faith-based organization. The next piece is, how do I take that and actually build out a strategy around this? So I know things now that I maybe previously didn't know or had some ideas about. And the next step for me is, I think I can grow that we've been growing at a certain rate, and I think I can focus on growing that 43% recurring donor base average gift size. So of the people that I already have engaged, the people who are giving on a regular basis, what if I can get them to make a gift to average out to be more towards the 650 amount? And so a lot of this is just using what you already know and then putting an aggressive target on it and putting that number out there for a group of people, either the rest of the team from an employee perspective, or maybe you're largely volunteer driven and you're empowering your board. People gravitate towards specific numbers and what it helps them accomplish. And, a lot of these are based on assumptions that we've already seen. So we know that 43% of our base is growing. We also have some historical data around how much people tend to contribute more when asked. So I'm using that to kind of build out my 30% assumption. If you don't have enough to pull something like that, or to pick a number, a lot of times there are great resources online for you to just have a starting benchmark and you apply that to your own numbers, and you take that 43%, and if the average would be to grow it by 20, you use 20 instead. So sometimes you got to work with what you have when it's a more limited data set and make some important assumptions that you document and share with everybody and get them on board. So the impact of doing that, to go from 50 to 650, would be that would make up 67K of the overall 200,000 goal that we're working for. And so now we've got this number that's out there. We've used lagging indicators to help us build that number, and we want to move towards some of those leading ones. So that's what's we're gonna get towards on some of the next areas. But the next piece here is that we also have a group of people that we can re-engage and grow. So those people who weren't donating, but we found them in our data, maybe we can get them to step in again and start donating and grow that a little bit as well. Maybe not as aggressively as the previous category, but we're going to introduce the stories of why we're trying to do what we're doing, and specifically talk to them about, we know you've contributed in the past. It's a new path that we're striking for our organization. Are you willing to contribute? And give them kind of targets and ideas about what this giving will mean to your overall strategy and what part they're playing in that story. And so we get a number from that as well that says it's a 34K increase to that 20K goal. That leaves us with a 98K gap. So this is where we were talking about do we know what is going to be remaining for us in that gap to actually close out. And we've got 490 new donors required instead of the original 700. So because of the two other strategies on the side, where we're not just going to accept that what we've done in the past is where we're going to be, we're going to set some targets around these particular segments of our donors. So we've got two segments right now. That brings us down to only needing 490 new donors, which is still a pretty tall order. So we maybe are going to have to do some additional work. But now we're assuming we grow those high value donors an additional 40%. So again, this is based on what we've been able to do in the past. So we've been able to continuously grow past donors by a certain percentage in this category of high value. And you can determine what high value means for you. I generally take a list of donors and will cut, the top 20%. Those are my high value donors, and whatever that threshold is where I'm going to set it. So in the case of this organization, that's about at around $1,000. And if we can get 15 to 20 new donors in that $1,000 category, it's going to add and contribute to that goal as well. And so these become very targeted groups that we are reaching out to. And that leaves us with an additional 390 smaller gifts online that we need to come up with. Again, we've been pulling away from that 700 number, trying to make it more manageable, trying to get more specific, really segmenting our audience based on what we know and who our donors already are and what we can ask from them that seems reasonable. So I brought that diagram back to keep us in mind as we try and work into some of the leading KPIs. Some of the strategic initiatives based on where we were, and I'm making a couple of leaps here, but this is, from my perspective, this is how it works. You put those big goals out there, you try and make them more manageable with data, and then ultimately it's your people and your passion and your focus that will drive home. We picked these segments. We know we can get this done. Now what's going to be the strategy to address each of those, in this case, 4 segments that we identified. So the donor stewardship piece, we're going to have to tap into our board. We're going to have to do more personalized outreach in order to engage those higher value donors in those 2 segments that we identified. One of the things that would be a leading KPI in this case is an engagement tracking metric. So we've got number of calls or meetings set per week to try and reach out to this group, and the ratio of that. So this might be a part where you have to look at, of the major donors we have, how much outreach do we have to do on average to bring that gift in every year? So maybe it's, you know, a couple of calls and a lunch, or maybe it is a very long 6-month process, or you're going to have a really deep dive with this person and then they will contribute. And you can get some averages from that, but then you start out with a leading indicator. So how many meetings are we actually doing? You can get as aggressive even as setting your board members targets for, like, it would, you know, from a fundraising perspective, we're going to give you some major talking points. We need you to do, you know, a couple of meetings a week for the next 4 weeks or something. It really depends on the engagement level of your board or your volunteers. But that number of calls, meetings would be a good example of what a leading KPI is, because it's going to drive the ability to actually reach the larger lagging goals that we put in front. Email marketing campaigns and online forums, mission-focused stories, that's really targeted at that existing donor base that's in the smaller category and growing them by a certain percentage, so that 20% growth in this case. And an example of leading indicators in this category would be email click-through rate. So a lot of this engagement is being done not as interpersonally, and then the conversion through, you know, like let's say I click on a donate button on a website, what's the number of people who actually make that conversion onto a donation form. So the number of visitors versus the number of people who completed the action. So in this case, making a donation. Wealth screening, if we're going to go out and find some bigger donors, we may need to do some wealth screening on our existing contact database, and we may need to do some networking in order to find out people who are very passionate about the type of work we do, but we don't know who they are. And again, that board network can be a great way for you to tap into finding more people who would be interested in contributing. Examples of leading KPIs on this side would be number of prospects that you're adding net new, and the prospect stage conversion rate. That's a pretty hefty term. What that basically means is, of the people that you have reached out to, who is moving through to actually returning your phone call or meeting up with you, and then who's stepping up to then at another stage to say, I'm considering making a gift, and then finally that completion stage of I'm committing and I'll do it in this time frame. So there's a lot of similarities here in, like, I don't know, a sales pipeline process or something where you're really trying to move people through a set of stages, and at each point, the more you know about your ability, like the percentage that will convert of these new people added or these new prospects, the more you can predict where you'll be at and how much more outreach you might need to be doing. For that 390 group that we identified, this might be a time where we want to introduce a new strategy. We know we've got this great group of people who are donating under $100. They probably won't be able to give more, but we don't know. But they most likely they have friends and family who might give in their stead and help them raise that money. So introducing a peer-to-peer component. We don't have the network yet. We don't have the people who are in our donor database, but if we assign out folks to help us with this type of strategy that might be excited about it, we can then get them creating fundraising pages. So a leading KPI here would be, how many fundraising pages have we been able to create and have people put their unique stories behind, and then the average fundraising goal that's being set per page. So those two would help us know how close are we getting to closing that, you know, $80,000 gap that we were trying to with that 390 group of people. We do have the second example here on the contact data. I'm going to be mindful of time because I know we do want to leave some time for Q&A, but I'm not going to try and speed through it. It's a little bit less dense. This is also because contact data is more complex to work with in a lot of ways and doesn't have as many numbers associated with it like a donation amount does. But the reason that I bring this type of example up is because it's not always about growth when you're looking at numbers. Sometimes it is about identifying how you need to slow down as an organization. And data can tell you that you've spread yourself too thin. Data can tell you that the things you thought you should be focusing your time on is not actually correct, and that's not where your time should be invested. So in this case, I pulled, it's a much larger organization. We've got 6,000 constituents. They've probably got, over 15,000 people participating in donations, memberships, et cetera. They have a big upcoming annual conference that they put a ton of staff energy into. They've experienced a significant amount of staff turnover. So there's a number of factors that I think would probably resonate with a lot of the organizations on the call, that really trying to figure out, we don't know what our strategic plan is. We don't know where we should head yet. We know what we're good at. We know what we love doing, but we've got ourselves spread in a lot of different directions. And what do we really want to be focusing on? So, where are we right now? And what are we doing well? What do we need to change? So that's really the focus of this type of example. And a lot of cases, I think, is what contact data can tell you the best, is how do you slow down a little bit and pay more attention to your donors. Using those same frameworks, though, the questions here of combined growth and engagement, and that's because in the case of this donor data, they're one and the same. So, I think about, like, of the new people that we've been adding, or the constituents, accounts, I've used those terms kind of, interchangeably here. How many are repeat contributors or have engagement year over year? So how many people are we really retaining, keeping, like participating in the work we're doing? Who's the group that we're actually serving? That volume piece, this organization understands themselves as a national org, even an international one. So we want to make sure that the volume of people that are participating and the efforts that they're putting in being that national group is properly distributed, and that's represented in the actual data. So the biggest thing that they have the most data on is around these events. The conference is the biggest sign of that. So there's a lot of conference data analysis in here too, and attendees. That gap piece. Where does the organization have some traction that could be expanded on? So in their case, it isn't about, we've got this big financial goal out there we want to hit, but we want to know, what are we doing well that we could be doing more of, so that we can really focus in on that and maybe cut out some of the extraneous work that we're doing. Different look at a gap. I've looked at this one a little bit differently too, because from the contact data perspective, when we're looking at this, they identified major interactions they have throughout the year. The conference was a big one, and the events overall was a big one. And when we looked at it, what we found was that there's little to no repeat attendance at major events. And that was actually a bit of a shock, because they have the same amount of attendees year over year. And the reality was that it was different groups of people that they were having to put a ton of effort into getting them to show up every single year. But it was about the same number of attendees. And so what had been happening is that the repeat attendance was going down over and over and over again. And so that kind of said, like, we need to switch something up in our programming. We are not giving people what they were expecting, or we're giving them little incentive to show up next year. Maybe we gave them a program in which everything they wanted to get was happening in that single conference, and they're not going to show up again next year, which, if that's their strategy, that's fine. But in this case, that was not their intent. We also realized that they were highly regional. So even though they understood themselves as a national organization, most of their attendees and participants were coming from 4 particular states. And ironically, they're not a West Coast organization. So this was pretty surprising as well. There were just some misunderstandings about who was actually being serviced in this particular group and where they were doing the best. So we had 56% of their overall database was coming from 4 states in and of them, like just by those 4 states. All of these things, though, can be turned into opportunities. So when we look at this, the positives on this side was that overall attendance had not dropped at all. But if we could change the programming, if the conference and the events are a really big part of who this organization understands itself to be, if we can change the programming and update, even get a small amount of increase in the participation, that could mean big returns for the overall org. So a 15% increase in returning attendees. So let's say we're going back to our 2016 number of 6%, basically a little over doubling that. That would mean a significant amount of increased revenue, and they wouldn't be spending as much time trying to get new people on, especially as they wanted to develop people over time. And then the other piece of this, even though we noticed there was a problem on one side with it being concentrated and them a not national organization, we've got 4 states where participation was strong, but it could be grown, and they already had a foot in the door on. We had that 18% of the people in their contact database were in target states that we could continue to expand. So these are the types of things that they were looking for in terms of focus. Maybe they're not going to put as much work into the international group that they were initially thinking they would expand into. That brings us over to the KPIs section. So the strategic initiatives that got drawn from this type of an analysis were focus on the events and the marketing outreach on those states where they have room to grow. They've already got a foot in the door. They're not starting from scratch. And there's also enough of a population there that's interested to make that growth justifiable. In a lot of cases, it's as simple as, is the outreach that we're doing from a measurement perspective actually producing people who are opening emails or coming to the website? There's a lot of different examples of this, but that was an example of a leading KPI in this category that you could measure this type of work with. And this was another tough conversation that had to be had, is either they're going to pull back on their events and or they're going to rethink that conference programming altogether so that people would actually want to return year over year. And the number of participants in the engagement activities would be a way of measuring that. So if you're going to run a poll or a survey of your people, what percentage of the folks would respond back to something? You've attended a conference in the past. How many of the people that you send that to are actually going to engage in that with you? Introducing an online community was another big conclusion that they came to, is that maybe we're not going to get people to travel as much as they once did, or it's not as big of a part of, maybe we should introduce an online either aspect to the conference itself or have an online community where people can do forum posts, talk to each other, and provide more of that throughout the year engagement. And this could be measured by things like number of signups for the online portal, number of logins, number of content posts and activity that's actually happening on the site. And if that number was big enough, they could justify adding additional staff, et cetera. So that was one of the big strategic takeaways that came out of this type of data. And it's just like 1 or 2 key areas that are pulled out. There's obviously a lot more you can do with it, but I always like to pick that like 1 or 2 assumptions that I had going in, challenging them, seeing what the data produces, and then thinking about that and how it might actually change the way that the direction of the organization was headed in, and what we could change and do differently. That brings me to the review section. We've got the main points that I know we went through a couple of fast examples, is understanding that difference between lagging and leading indicators. So the main goal here is that lagging indicators develop out your data and help you report on what has happened for your organization. They're not going to tell you what is going to happen, but they're certainly going to tell you where you've been. Leading indicators should be designed to help you measure those strategic initiatives that you are pursuing and whether you're going to actually make the progress on the goals that you want to have, and then allow you to see whether you're moving the needle, or if you're not, why is that? What are the underlying causes that are happening? The other main takeaway here is that historical performance should drive your future strategy to some degree. Going from a $60,000 to a $200,000 bump is not going to happen overnight just because we want it to. So knowing where we're at is actually going to dictate a little bit of what we are going to focus on, the segments that we're going to create, and who's really going to be driving and owning each of those different segments. And the final piece is that while KPIs in broad understanding, like the overall year over year growth may be great. You have to nuance it a little bit. If we hadn't taken those $10,000 donations out of the data set for our particular group, then we might have, come up with an average that doesn't work as well. So there's certain things that about your data that you should inject in there and change and filter it differently so that you can really draw something useful, that allow you to formulate these hypotheses that you ask and look out for that unexpected decision or challenging of your assumptions that you may have. So that brings me to the conclusion of what I wanted to talk through with you all today. And I think at this point, I hand it back over to Elizabeth.
Yes, Nina, thank you so much for taking us and just walking us through just those different types of frameworks and how to approach the data from those perspectives. We've been getting lots of thank yous coming in through the chat, so I wanted to let you know that before we did start our Q&A. Our first question actually comes in from Beth. It's a little involved, so I'm going to go through it slowly and give you a second to think through it before responding. So Beth is coming from a new organization. They have limited and fairly often inaccurate information for their donations that were made prior to this year. She's wondering where to start in building a database or a donor management strategy, and she's having to build this from scratch. And she's really working on trying to make sense of the old, possibly wrong information ahead of our year-end giving season, which is right around the corner. So really the point of the question is, how can she maximize her time and effort as she's approaching this data for her new organization? As I said, I'll give you a second to think through this because I know it can be a bit nuanced and it might vary from org to org. And I do also want to share some upcoming opportunities with our participants here as well. So we do have a couple of additional opportunities for folks. For those of you who want to continue diving into data, we do have a self-paced e-learning course that shows you what kinds of data corporate social responsibility executives are looking for in their nonprofit partners. During this course, you will learn how to catch a potential partner's attention through captivating reporting and successful collaboration with your marketing colleagues. And then coming up in December, we are offering some more information on giving season specifically, and we're actually going to help you leverage the impact of your major gift donors, so you can really make sure that you not just catch them during the end of your giving season, but you also continue stewarding that relationship into the new year. So with that, Nina, what are your recommendations for Beth? She's starting from scratch, wants to maximize her efforts before the year-end giving season with some limited and inaccurate data.
Yeah, so I think what I would start with is this is where we go actually to the smaller data set, since it's going to take maybe a longer time to clean up the bigger one, is to pick out that like top representative donations that you get. Maybe there's a pattern there of like, here's how many donors I have, I estimate that I have that represent this like under $50 category or whatever the threshold that makes sense for you. Do I have any major donors that I can take advantage of? And you actually pay specific attention to developing the personas around each of those groups. So instead of trying to go with a big data analysis where we get everything cleaned up and it's perfect, you find like the representative pieces. So you take your messy spreadsheet, or I've worked with like Post-it notes that I had to pull out of a Rolodex and then type into a spreadsheet at some point, and you pull out, what do I think is the most representative? So this is where you can use your brain instead of Excel and just say like, I'm seeing a lot of $25 donations, or I see a couple of big ones, and focus in on who are those people, why are they giving the way they do, and actually develop more of your online, I'm sorry, not your online, but your fundraising strategy for the end of year by specifically talking to those people and understanding why they contributed, and writing marketing campaigns and outreach that's based on very personal stuff and the smaller data set than the bigger analysis. But I bet you could still get, even with you got some inaccuracy in there, you could still get to like an average donation size and put that into some of your campaigns to say like, we've been able to start and found our organization. We could really use, a $5 increase on top of our average, which has been a $20 amount over time. So you can give some of those like smaller numbers that might motivate people to push the needle a little bit out on their giving. That would be my recommendation to start.
Thank you, Nina. I think that's a really great recommendation. Rather than looking at the daunting task ahead, let's piece it out into something that's a bit more manageable, I think
Mhm.
is a really good approach there. Um, our next question comes in from Jeannie, and she's asking about, particular databases. Are there particular aspects or characteristics in a database that folks should be paying attention to that would help them mine raw
Mhm.
data a bit more efficiently or effectively?
Sure, yeah. There's kind of two different strategies that databases will take you in, and one is that it's going to serve you up information that's already kind of pre-categorized. So the systems I've worked in, like the Donor Perfects, the Razor's Edges, like all those, those types of products, including, Neon CRM as well, the company that I work with, they all have dashboards and things that will present you with metrics. And I tend to prefer looking for a system that will give me like a really robust report where I can pick and choose my columns in like their raw format and then cutting them up a bunch of different ways on my own in Excel. So I like to have a little bit of both because it orients me with my dashboard, saying like, here's probably what I might want to look into more. So I'm not starting from scratch. But most of the database options out there will give you some kind of exportable report that you can work with cleanly. The other big piece of it, though, especially around transactional data, is making sure that you can categorize, like not everything's thrown into the same pile. Not just because you collected the money, it might be for the rental of a space, or it might be for, some item that they bought in an online store, or the case, it could be a lot of different things that you're able to actually break out your donations from your event registrations, from your maybe more like miscellaneous types of purchases, that the database allows you to differentiate those things, can be really important for analyzing it and getting a lot more out of it. So that's where I'd start.
Thank you, Nina. And then we have another question that came in from Susan. How would you recommend new organizations start to create their initial donor database and figure percentages and goals, especially for folks that are just starting out?
hmm Um, so I think it's a question of, the volumes of when, like, what's the right time to even get a donor database? Um, if you're spending a ton of time typing data into an accounting system already, it might be time then to look for something that you can type it in there and it'll push to an accounting system. So at least you're getting the data into a system that you can run some reports out of. But the main piece of it is getting the columns correct in the spreadsheet and using some cleanup of like, I know what I'm going to want to look at to start, and keeping it really simple. So first name, last name, email, address information, donation amount, donation date, like not trying to add in all of these complexities of like it was, we have 5 different campaigns and we have all these exceptional reasons as to why this donor has to be treated or done a certain way. So like I really just think about it as, how do we get a donation form up online so that we can hopefully underwrite the cost of whatever system we've built just by new donations that we're promoting there, getting a cost associated with that so that if it's a couple $1,000s or it's only a few $100 a year, that you can know like how much more would I need to fundraise in order to justify this purchase. Because if you've got a budget of like under 5K or something, from any, like you're not fundraising a lot, you're really, really just getting started, it might be better to start with more of like a capacity building tool, like just an online fundraising form instead of a full database in CRM, because those systems will still give you reports.
Thanks. I think that's really practical advice, Nina. And folks are continuing to say thank you through the chat. So all of your advice has been fairly helpful today.
Okay.
Um, our next question comes in from Derek, and he wants to know if you have any tips on how he can get his organization to start including leading KPIs when they're currently only have lagging KPIs. Who should be involved in that conversation? How do you actually, start moving in that direction with your org?
Yeah. Um, this is the actually the really fun part in my mind, is like getting people to see the power of, you can actually tell how well you are going to do in the future if you pay attention to leading KPIs. So what I tend to do in order to get the buy-in is start with the lagging ones and then present a couple of leading ones that actually the pattern repeats itself. So here's how we know we have X number of donors or engagements that we, have been added to our system. If you can find one of those patterns, that you can demonstrate and say, like, this is the power of understanding what leading KPIs are, that we can actually predict and forecast a little bit where our organization is headed. That can be really powerful. And then the other piece of it is just, I think, the education side of it. People just don't, I mean, not everybody, but some people don't feel comfortable even messing about in Excel, and, making people feel comfortable that they can make mistakes or like cut the data a bunch of different ways, and show them the power of like feeling like they can actually own it and pay attention to it a little bit more, might get them to a place where you can actually do, a pipeline analysis if they're a major gift officer, or, you've got a volunteer who's doing that work, where how many calls have you made? What's the response rate on that? It makes it more of a conversation of like what they're actually doing on the day to day and how they want to spend their time, as opposed to, well, here's what we did over and over again. So it really, I think it values how people are investing in you more when you're looking at it from a leading perspective, and just making sure that they feel comfortable exploring that data with you can be a great place to start.
Thank you, Nina. Our next question comes in from Jenny, and she wants to know if there are any online resources available that could actually help her think about their strategy, particularly in making assumptions as how they could move forward in moving those lagging and leading KPIs along.
Yeah, so there's definitely a ton of blog posts available on leading and lagging indicators both, and some recommendations. So a lot of times, since if you don't know where to start, you just take the formulas that somebody else gives you. If you Google leading and lagging indicators for nonprofits, they will come up. But one of um, the fundraising effectiveness project is a great place to start. They do a lot on KPIs and tracking how the overall nonprofit industry is doing. So that's a great resource. I think the Giving Institute is another one that often has a lot of data and suggestions and posts on that. So those would be the two that I think have some of the highest quality work in that category. But even just some general Google searches will produce quite a lot of like, oh, I can just take this one and see if it tells me something useful.
Thank you. And Eliana posed this question early on, but I think it's worth, reiterating.
Mhm.
So for organizations that do receive either those planned gifts or legacy gifts,
Mhm.
when they're actually going in and looking at their data, do you recommend actually taking out those what we
Mhm.
quote unquote called super major donors in order to
Mhm.
get a truly average gift size of your donor population?
Yeah, so that's where I think that the category plays a role too. So I would do a couple of cuts. I would pull out everybody who is in that legacy planning category all in its own, regardless of size. I'd put it, usually they're bigger gifts, but I would put them in their own thing and do an analysis over there. And then I would definitely recommend that you can decide the percentages. It really depends on how diverse your giving is. If you've got mostly people at the bottom and mostly people at the top, then maybe you only cut it up into 3 buckets of like bottom 25%, middle 50, and top 25. But if you've got a lot in the range, then it might make sense to take those top, put them off in their own category, and then add maybe 5 or 6 even new layers of like top 20, top 15, like the next 15, whatever those layers are going to actually produce something meaningful, especially if you have a team of people who's responsible for like different segments. But otherwise, I just say start as simple as possible. It'll give you the biggest data set, and it'll be the most predictive. If the data set is bigger, it'll tell you more.
Thank you. Speaking of predictive,
Mhm.
Caroline had a question. Are new donors really as likely to give the same average gift amount as repeat donors who are actively engaged with the organization?
It's a totally fair question. Um, so it really depends on the nonprofit, and you can look at like what was the average gift size of a person the first time they gave. So not looking at the year over year so much, but saying like when was the first time they gave, and taking the average of all of those donations could be interesting. I would generally say probably not. So you could pick, like take the overall recurring donation or the people who are repeat donors and, I don't know, cut it in half by 50% even, and nuance that against the like first gift category. Because a lot of this is interpretation. The data in and of itself doesn't always give you the complete answer, but it gives you a good grounding to start with. So I think you can assume, it will be a percentage under what the overall gift is if you don't have access to that first donation. But the beauty of a lot of this stuff, and there are tons of resources on this, is like if you can get that person to give again within 3 months, even if it's a small gift, doesn't even matter what it is, they will their chances of becoming a repeat donor for the next 3 or 4 years it spikes. I can't remember what the exact percentage is, but it goes from like 20% to like 60 or 70. It's this insane thing if you can just like re-engage them right away, again, even if it's a really small gift. So I tend to focus on, okay, repeat donations instead then.
Thank you, Nina. And just letting folks know, we do still have plenty of time for Q&A. So if there are any other new questions that you have, feel free to continue submitting them. We'll do our very best to get to as many as possible. For right now, we're looking pretty good. Our next question comes in from Cecilia, and she says that they are a very small and new organization, and they're focusing on major donors. So as it relates to the board, is there a way to get them to actually register their contacts with new potential donors, or a way for them to register what they do and what their next action should be? Our board members are typically volunteers, so we're already asking a lot of them, but how can we make this really easy for them to actually record? That way we can actually do that contact data analysis.
Yeah, so I think this is the beauty of having your own numbers that you're presenting and showing them why you have to justify why they should spend their time recording, data into a spreadsheet. If you're like, let's say you're just going to give them a Google sheet and say, hey, can you put the name of the person, the amount that you think you're going to cultivate with them, and even the date of last contact and your next move. I do think it's probably a little bit too much to ask of any donor to be logging into a CRM or something and like tracking their pipeline. But I think there is a degree to which you can do that for them if you get the basics to put it into a format that works for you. But in order for them to understand like why they are doing that, it's usually the strategy of like you're assigned a certain amount of fundraising activity. We're going to provide you with some information and tools that we think can help you cultivate that. And then as you give us the feedback too, we can better support you with talking points and with like why this gift matters, or we can do the mission part of this that you have the voice for, to free you up. So I tend to keep it like when you're using the board members or the volunteers for that, you got to keep it, you maybe get like 4 questions that they're going to answer for you, and making that a part of the routine of when you have a board meeting or when you send out an email to just say like, hey, can you update your last 5 contacts, or where you're at with that. And if you do, that's what gets us to this, that's where the thermometers or the charts or the visualizations really help, is like, if you do this, this is the potential impact for our organization, and here's what it will help us predict. So it's a little bit of give and take where you're meeting them halfway in terms of what you're expecting, and also helping them understand why it matters with data presentation.
Thank you, Nina. The next question we have is a follow-up from Santiago. He wants to know if you have any forecasting method that's related to seasonality.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So I generally have done, it's a tougher question. What I do generally put things into quarters if I'm trying to forecast, and I think there's heavy seasonality. Usually when we see the seasonality, it's either the spike at the end of the year, or there's major events or like galas or something that are happening that are causing that spike. And so if it's around a particular event or campaign that always happens, you can usually just segment those times of years out from the rest of the year. You average out the remaining piece. So if you've got a spike in April and a spike in December or November, December, you treat those as like their own times of the year with their own growth comparison. So maybe April over April, if you run the same event year over year, and then November, December over November, December. And then the rest of the time you potentially average out. But that's like that chart that I showed at the very beginning where I've got the quarters of like where the growth is happening. That helps me identify some of the seasonality in the first place, because maybe I don't know where it is to begin with. And then when it comes to forecasting, I can treat the spike, the ones that are not as close to that average, I can treat them differently and separate them out from a predictive standpoint.
Thank you for fielding the tougher, more nuanced question,
Mhm,
Nina. I do appreciate that.
mhm,
And coming from Scott, he wants to know how you or
mhm,
perhaps folks should
mhm,
define a recurring donor. Would you do it by either donations over multiple years or multiple times per year or multiple months, a second gift within 3 months? How would you
mhm,
actually go about like analyzing that for a recurring donor if you needed to
mhm.
define it?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of recurring, I work in so much technology and software these days that like I only think of someone as recurring who has basically online committed to having their credit card or their, bank draft automatically scheduled for like every month or every quarter, and it's really they've made that commitment. You could do something where like they've made a pledge and they're going to pay within that time frame as well, or make the donation within that time frame. But that's really, I would think about a recurring donor as someone who has said they are going to give at this time repeatedly for a certain, whatever, a year, 3 months, even if you want to, but like that's more of like a campaign to me of like they gave you for a certain period of time. But I would definitely define recurring donors as somebody who's like they are going to give every you know, month, a certain amount. It's already scheduled. It's on, running on a credit card, through an online system. That's tended to be the way that I think. And then everybody else is just a re-engaged, like they're giving multiple times, and you might want to have a report that shows me, here's everybody who's given more than 3 times, or more, whatever the appropriate segment is for you. More than twice might be a big deal, and can we get a bunch of these one-time donors into 2 or 3 times? But I wouldn't consider them recurring donors. They're just people I've reactivated.
Thank you. I think that distinction is actually quite helpful. And then Patricia wants to know, as it relates to the analysis that we walked through,
Mhm,
would different sectors approach that analysis differently? Perhaps, higher education institutions versus a human services institution,
mhm.
or would the approach be fairly similar?
Well, I think the overall, like the frameworks themselves stay pretty similar. The way that you frame up the question that you're going to ask, though, would change. So with the faith-based organization, I was dealing with their particular context. It's a small data set. It's not so much about the sector as it is about the data size. But certainly for like an educational institution where there's, concepts of alumni years and these other things that you can tap into, or a humanities organization where there's maybe some performances or events or conferences or content that's being pushed out certain times of the year, you'd probably pay attention to it a little bit differently. So if it's a theater group or a humanities or performance org, you might ask like, how does our the season that we run grow year over year? It only runs from September to January, so we're only going to look at that. And then, for an educational institution, it might be, how are we activating people at their, 1 5-year anniversary, 10-year anniversary? So you just ask slightly different questions about how you're tracking your growth or how you're going to segment your group.
Thanks, Jamie. The next question that I have for you is, would you recommend analyzing event donation data separate from perhaps your annual fund donation data?
Yeah. So I think you should be able to both segment out your event data and then put it back in again. The main question for me, though, and a lot of this stuff, is how much of that is actually tax deductible, because you do want to be paying attention to like, these are things that are 100% tax deductible. These are things that are given because somebody received a service or a nice meal or something in response to what we did. And the ways that I've activated that person is very different than somebody who maybe just went online, read about your mission, and made a contribution, or had a conversation with somebody on your team, or had been impacted by the cause that you work in. So I do always pull out event data. Sometimes I put it back in though if it's completely tax deductible, especially when I'm looking at like overall year over year growth, is I want to know like what percentage of my growth is because I ran a really successful event, and what percentage of my growth is because we're getting more online donors or more people in the annual appeal. The second part of your question though, I think, was that just how do I separate out my end of year or whatever my annual appeal is going to look like. I think it's useful to do it. You might discover that, how many of those people might give at other times of the year. So I'd kind of like to see them side by side, because maybe you've got a group of people as you're only going to get to ask them once. That's the way that they, plan out their personal philanthropy, or however, that may just be their approach. So if you could take a look at like, here's who gives in the annual campaign and here's who gives through the rest of the year. Is there any overlap between those two? Is there more potential there for people to give smaller contributions throughout the year? I think that would be an interesting overlay.
Thank you, Nina. And then just a quick clarifying question.
Yeah.
The two sites that you mentioned earlier, we got Giving Institute as one, but could
Hmm.
you rephrase the second one for us?
Yeah, it was the Fundraising Effectiveness Project.
The Fundraising Effectiveness Project. We got a number of questions of that after the
Hmm.
fact.
Yep.
Well, with that, Nina, I want to say thank you so much. This has been such a well-received webinar. I was very excited to dig in. It's a new topic for us to cover. We've definitely have talked about impact and evaluation and data, but I think really learning how to segment your DOTA data, how to find those KPIs, and how to actually continue moving your organization forward has been really, really thoughtful. So thank you so much for your time. On behalf of our team here at Candid and our presenter, thank you so much for joining us today. If you like this webinar, we hope that you join us again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.